Good morning. I'm Steve Morgan, Head of Policy and Infrastructure at Recoup, and welcome to the first of 5 webinars for Recoup members on a range of areas that are impacting or will impact the plastic value chain in the coming years. Firstly, thank you to our chair and speakers today, Paul Sanderson, Kinta Sutton, Jez Blake, Tim Durrett, and also Dr. Jeff Brighty. And thank you also to all you for making the time to actually come on the webinar today. Change slides, please, Bex. So maybe most of you are familiar with Recoup and its aims and objectives across plastics recycling and also plastics efficiency and educating the consumer. But for those of you who are less familiar, we're an organisation that was set up just over 30 years ago to recycle some plastic bottles from Bring schemes, and we've been growing since then. So we're now quite an extensive membership of 150 members that work across the many sectors involved in the value chain. So local authorities, waste management companies, brands, retailers, recyclers, academia, etc. Next slide, Bex. Thanks. There is 4 main areas to our work: policy and infrastructure, packaging, recycling and design, sustainability and circularity, and communications engagement with the consumer. And within these areas, there's a whole raft of activities that take place. So we've got many reports that we produce, including recyclability by design, research reports around collection, sorting and reprocessing of plastics, and also, of course, our consumer-facing Pledge to Recycle Plastics program. And more information can be found on our website. Next slide, please, Bex. Just a few words about the series of webinars. This one is focused on the future of plastic recycling markets. So we're obviously at the start of extensive policy changes in the UK. So things like the plastic packaging tax, the reform of the packaging reducer responsibility, use of deposit return schemes, consistent recycling collections, and of course changes around the export of recycling materials. So we're also seeing some fantastic technology being developed as well, and some of that you will hear more about today. So this webinar will be looking at the future of the recycling markets and how the UK will need to adapt and increase its own recycling capability to meet future demands. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in this area of work, but it's also hugely challenging as well. As said, this is the first of 5 webinars, with the others focusing on a range of different topics. So this week we've got consumer behaviour in relation to plastic packaging, which is tomorrow, highlighting the challenge of driving behaviour change for the plastic recycling message. And next week, we've got on Tuesday, we'll be exploring some of the challenging solutions around the circularity and sustainability in complex sectors. On Wednesday, it will be the launch and findings of the 2021 Recoup Household Plastics Collection Survey. And finally, on Thursday, it'll be about plastic film recycling and the challenges obviously that lay ahead for that. And if you're interested in attending any of those webinars, please go to our website, or you can pick the details up from the last member update that was sent out last Friday. Just a few words about housekeeping and how the webinar runs. Do not use the chat function because it's not operational today, and also don't raise your virtual hand either. You can put questions in the Q&A section, which is the bottom of your screen, and that will be active. So those will go to each presenter after their session, and also it could be stored back at the end as well for a debate if we've got the time. Our speakers will have their cameras on when they're presenting and off when they're not, and the webinar is also being recorded. We will actually be circulating these slides afterwards, so you can take screenshots by all means, but obviously we'll be circulating the slides as well, and also recording for you to look back on if that's needed. Bex will be, my colleague Bex will be controlling the slides, so obviously the presenters will need to tell her to flip the slides when required. Finally, so thank you to everyone again for your time today, and I'll pass you across to Paul Sanderson, who will be chairing today's session. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to yourself and Rebecca for inviting me to chair chair today's webinar. Really looking forward to hosting it. Just a little bit about myself. I'm Paul Sanderson. I'm the co-founder of Recycling Insights, which is a data service for the recycling industry powered by artificial intelligence. So we look at things like pricing, we do forecast prices, and have lots of economic data that you can compare correlations between that and pricing too. So if you'd like to find out more about that, please get in touch. And I'm also in charge of REB Market Intelligence, which provides daily news on the markets. I've been in the recycling sector since about 2004 as a journalist, and thoroughly enjoyed my time in it. So I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, so I will ask Kinza Sutton, who is Head of Public Affairs and Sustainability at Plastipack, to give her presentation, and afterwards we'll have some questions. Kinza.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. As Paul just said, I actually work for Plastipack in the UK, but I also work for Clean Tech. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Bex. So just a quick one about Plastipack. We're actually an American-based company, and we're now in something like our 54th year of trading. We're a significant rigid plastic packaging producer, producing over 42 billion units a year across USA, South America, and Europe. And as well as being a major rigid plastic packaging producer, we're also a major recycler with 4 recycling plants, 3 of which are in Europe. And we're actually the largest producer of food grade rPET in both UK and in Europe. Next slide, please. In terms of the UK, we are actually one of the major producers of PET preforms and bottles, making not only bottles but also containers for soft drinks, home care, personal care and food industries. And Plastipack UK also wholly owns Clean Tech, which is a PET reprocessor based in Lincolnshire. And our recycling plant there is based on a bottle-to-bottle model. So the majority of the rPET that we produce there is actually shipped straight back to the Plastipack site in North Wales, where it's included right back into new bottles. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, Plastipack is a strong proponent of closed-loop recycling, and that is exactly what all of our recycling plants are based on. So essentially, we manufacture the bottles, we send them to the fillers, who then send them to retailers, with consumers then consuming, hopefully recycling, and then following collecting, bottles are sorted. They're sent, majority of them in the UK are sent back to Clean Tech in Lincolnshire, and then the rPET is then sent back to Plastipack, and so the cycle continues. Next slide, please. Now, the first thing I want to say is when we talk about the future of recycling, we need to first of all have a look at what is actually going on in the PET packaging market. And because we are a PET specialist, that is the area of polymers that I will be focusing on today. So if we look at the PET packaging market, despite all of the anti-plastic sentiment, the market is actually forecast to grow significantly over the next 5 years. And I'm taking this data from Euromonitor, actually looking only at PET bottles and excluding trays and punnets or any sort of other non-bottle related PET packaging. Now, if we look at food, we can see here that the market is actually forecast to grow 13.6%, and we're actually seeing market replacement. So we're seeing some glass replacement coming in because it's lighter weight and lower carbon footprint. With soft drinks, despite all the noise around refill solutions and also the anti-plastics noise, we're actually again seeing an expected growth rate of 23.6% over the next 5 years. And we have to say as well that soft drinks for PET bottles represents the vast majority of the market, 88.7%. Home care is also forecast to grow 4.6%. Again, we're seeing substrate changes here. As PET is easy to include recycled content and also very easy to recycle, we are seeing some conversions from other polymers into PET. And it's the same with personal care, but not quite as much. And we're expecting that market to grow by 3.5%. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put all of that into the context of where rPET is going. So when we look particularly at the UK soft drinks market, the biggest trend by far is the inclusion of recycled material into bottles. And if we just look here in this central table here, we can see that the major brands, so Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Danone, etc., These guys actually represent something like 55% of the market. The figures actually dropped off there. But so these guys actually, you know, take a significant amount of the bottles that the UK produces. And then when you also look there, we will have private label in there, and they also take a significant amount. And it's worth noting there that they are part of the UK Plastics Pact. And that, along with the UK Plastics Tax coming along in March, mandates 30% recycled content. But you can see here that the major brands have all pledged to take either their whole portfolio or at least part of their PET portfolio into 100% rPET. And that's happening either now or within the next few years. Now, that clearly is driving the market for food grade recycled PET, both in the UK, but these are multinational brands as well. And they've also got that commitment across their various regions in the world, but Western Europe in particular. Next slide, please. So when we look at the rPET that we consume in Plastic Pack UK, so the only polymer that we do manufacturing in the UK is PET. And you can see that we've long been using rPET. The figures go back way before 2015. What you can see in around the sort of 2017 to 2018 point that the demand for rPET started going up rapidly. And then particularly at 2018, when the anti-plastic sentiment was really in full swing, we started seeing sort of quite large upswings in demand. Now, we've just finished our financial year, and so we now can confirm that 33% of the resin that we used in the factory this year was actually recycled material. This was actually forecast to be higher. However, the use of rPET was actually being constrained by availability of food grade rPET rather than a demand for our consumer or our customers to use it. So very much rPET is a strong business trend that we expect to impact our business significantly for the foreseeable future. Next slide. That leads us on to Coca-Cola. So in our markets, we actually see Coca-Cola being probably the biggest influence in terms of the soft drink market, although it has to be said that Pepsi are catching up quite quickly along with the other big two, Nestle and Danone. However, Coca-Cola have made a commitment by 2030 that they will stop using oil-based virgin PET by 2030 in Europe and Japan. So essentially what that statement means is that they will no longer use virgin PET, and the bottles will be made up of a combination of mechanically recycled rPET, plant-based or bioplastics PET, and also supported by enhanced, or what used to be called widely as chemical recycling. And the reason for that is that whilst PET is very good in a closed loop, it does degrade over time, although not as bad as what some of the other industries may claim. And you do need to be putting in some virgin resin to help maintain the quality of rPET. And that's where the enhanced chemical recycling will come in, because the rPET produced through this process has the same virgin-like properties. So not so good if you are a virgin resin supplier, and that is really why we're seeing most of those companies now moving into the recycled resin space. Next slide, please. Oh, go back. So if we look at where we are currently, so we can assess that the demand is well and truly there, and the demand will be there for the future. And that demand has been a problem for recyclers in the past, but it looks like that particular problem has well and truly gone away. We're also seeing, particularly around UK and Europe, a great number of PET reprocessing capacity spring up. And we're confident that in the future, reprocessing capacity is not going to be an issue. However, what we do now see is that PET collection is now going to be the that's going to be the bottleneck. And that is going to prevent the levels of PET required, or recycled PET required, in the future. Now, when I go to a lot of conferences and I talk to the governments and associations, DRS is brought in as going to be the silver bullet, the magic bullet. However, when we look at the PET collection rates across Europe, and this data is from a UNOMI report created for PETCOR Europe, the European Federation of Bottled Waters and Plastic Recyclers Europe, you can see that the green bars actually represent the countries where deposit return schemes actually currently do exist, whereas the blue bars are the countries where it relies on curbside or bring back collection. Now, what we can see from this graph is that whilst DRS does indeed drive higher collection rates, it's not absolutely a guarantee that we can get to that 100% level. Now, with so many of our soft drinks producers committing to 100% rPET, we really need to be collecting as much rPET as we can. 100% would be marvellous, because not only do we have the losses in that collection rate here, we must also think about losses that we encounter in the reprocessing as well. So deposit return scheme, whilst being very, very positive and we welcome it, we also need to think that it cannot be the only solution, and we still need to carry on focusing on other rates of return, such as the curbside collection system. Clearly as well, the deposit return system will not include food, home care and personal care bottles as well. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Another key issue that we're finding is increasingly we're seeing more and more material being taken from the PET closed loop by other applications, which to a certain extent we see as greenwashing. And a classic recent example of this was the COP26 plastic uniforms. So they were made out of rPET. Actually, they are being presented as a good thing, a positive thing. But actually what this is actually doing is taking material from the closed loop and it's actually putting it into the open loop, where it may be recovered at some point, but certainly at this moment in time, there's not really a recycling solution for this, apart from reuse and moving on. So we've seen a lot of this kind of example. We've seen a lot of like corporate gifts, for example, moving into this space. And what it's actually doing is, whilst it might be good from a consumer perception point of view, it's actually taking material away from where it's needed and where it will be reused on a repeat basis. And next slide. So just to summarise that, we know that the PET packaging market is forecast to grow quite significantly, and that growth alone means that 100% rPET is going to be a challenge going forward. We know that the major brands are also committed to 100% rPET, and what we also see is the sort of tier 2 brands and even tier 3 brands are certainly have moved already to 50%, and we expect them to catch up in time to 100%. However, collection is still the issue, and we know that DRS is not going to be around until 2024, maybe 2025. Scotland today appear to be delaying theirs till 2023. So we do have some significant years of challenge ahead in terms of feedstock for recycling. And the final point being that open loop rPET applications are removing material from circulation. So I hope that helps you today. This is our longer term view, and we'll see where the future takes us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kinza, for that presentation. I'd just like to ask the first question. I don't know if we've had any others as yet, so please do ask questions if you wish to. You mentioned about collection rates. Do you think the likes of DRS, EPR, the plastics tax will be, and all the sorts of additional funding that that's supposed to bring, will be sufficient to raise those collection rates, or do you think there'll need to be other solutions?
Very much deposit return scheme will help significantly, as long as it's correctly designed and correctly rolled out. We've seen, if we look at some of the other collection schemes in Europe, the starts have not been so great, and we need to take and learn the lessons from them to make sure that we get off to a really strong start. EPR should be a good way to help support the rest of the curbside collection. In terms of the plastic tax, we long saw the impact of recycled material is being driven more by the CSR policies or sustainability policies of the brands, and also by the UK Plastics Pact before the impact of the tax was even thought about. So for us personally as a company, whilst the plastics tax is being good, most of our customers will way beyond that 30% level anyway. But hopefully the combination of EPR and with that the sort of strong educational campaigns that have been promised in terms of recycling should help a lot.
Great. Thank you, Kinza. We've got some questions now. We've got two from Imogen Millwood, so I will ask both of those at the same time. How can we increase DRS and how can we reward recycling is her first question.
Well, deposit return scheme is all about that incentive to recycle. So really that's what we need to focus on, is getting those deposit return schemes in Scotland, England and Wales really designed well and set up correctly, so it makes it easy for people to return the products or the containers to those systems. PET is already collected in 100 by 100% of the local authorities. So really where the gap is missing is the on-the-go collection. And I think it's really about encouraging, sort of the education part of it, but also the media do not help us by continuing to vilify plastics, and also to give the impression that there's actually no recycling going on in this country and it all goes into the landfill or it all goes into countries, and that does not help.
Imogen also asks, why do we need bottles? Why can't you do drink stations in shops?
First of all, the volume of bottles that are produced each year, I think in the UK, thinking off the top of my head, it's something like 8.5 billion. So space-wise and logistically wise, it would not be possible to do refill stations all the way. I think they are a very positive step forwards and are appropriate for some products, but for others, we've got to think about the product quality and the product hygiene. So for things like carbonated soft drinks, for example, it'd be quite difficult to control the carbonation levels. But also if we think about other products that might need oxygen protection or light protection, we've got to think about those protection properties as well. Packaging is not just there for convenience, it's about product protection. But refill, it's certainly got a place in society and we expect that to increase.
Duncan Jones from the Hertfordshire Waste Partnership asks, do you think the 30% target in the plastic tax is window dressing and something that the major brands were always going to exceed?
We have to remember that the plastic tax does not apply just purely to PET, it applies to all polymers. Now, whereas for PET, certainly 30% is not a challenge and is already a target that has been set by the brands. If we look at other polymers, it will be a real challenge to get that 30% recycled content in there, but also it acts as an incentive to get those recycling or recycled markets going. PET is well established, HDPE is well established, but it's not so well established for the others. And therefore, I think 30% at this point is appropriate for those other polymers.
We have a question from Ribadeli, which is, what are the trends on collection and recycling of non-beverage PET packs, i.e. trays, etc.?
So at our recycling plant, we see a significant proportion of our feedstock is actually trays. So they are being widely collected. However, for the latest figures, I would refer you back to the Recoup webinar that's coming up in a few weeks, which is all about the latest collection landscape of household collection schemes. And I'm sure he will be able to shed a lot more detail on that subject than I can.
Anonymous attendee says, you describe reuse and refill as noise. Do you not feel these are important models that need to scale and plastics can play a part in?
I say that they're noise because they detract from some of the key issues that we really need to talk about. Reuse and refill is important. It's definitely here to stay, and we do consider it as an important market for our customers. However, we have to take into account the practical considerations. So that's all I can say really on that.
Ribadeli again asks, DRS is not the only solution to tackle PET collection bottlenecks. What about best practice? Yeah,
exactly. That's why I said, DRS cannot be the only solution. We have to consider others. If you look at Germany, I think the collection rate is about 94 or 96%, and that's probably one of the best in class along with Scandinavia. That still means there's a 4 to 5% gap that we need to collect, and that's the best in class. So it really is about developing these other solutions, and maybe it is time that we start to debate about whether DRS should be brought in for other non-beverage applications as well.
We'll just take 2 or 3 more, and Sean from Africa's largest food grade, I don't see the full title, says, why is so little rPET imported into the UK and EU? And we see in Africa, even with global approvals in place like FDA and EFSA, still very little interest out of the UK, EU and UK. Is that something that you're able to answer?
I'm not really sure I understand the question. Can you repeat it, please?
So why is so little rPET imported into the UK and EU, I guess, from elsewhere around the world,
Okay.
rather than from sort of UK and EU markets?
Okay, so first of all, the recycled material, we have to make sure that the most stringent quality standards are adhered to. So ultimately, it's a food grade product, so we have to make sure that it's a food safe product. So everything that comes into Plastipack is stringently tested, and not all of the brands available from both Europe and outside actually meet those stringent quality tests. Another reason is actually the carbon footprint behind transporting resin over long distances from outside of the EU. But also, of course, we do have to abide by EFSA approved qualifications, so that we will only use EFSA approved material. But also, we have to remind ourselves of the ESG principles behind rPET and any other material, so environmental, social and governance policies. So all of our customers have really strong ESG policies, and that means that we have to be confident that our rPET material has not been sourced or supported by anything like forced labour, child labour, etc. And it's very difficult to monitor that kind of production when it's not on your doorstep. I'm sure in time that rPET sourcing will develop, but that's one of the key issues that remain at the forefront of our mind, is how we can monitor personally that our material is compliant with the ESG standards.
I'm just going to take one more question from someone who hasn't asked one yet, and that's Henry Emblem. And he asks, where's the mechanism for revenue from the plastics tax being used for improvement of recycling?
The plastics tax has not been ring fenced at all for anything to support plastic collection or plastic recycling. The Treasury will, the plastics tax will just go into the general Treasury coffers and will not support, unlike EPR.
Great, thank you for that, Kinza. As Steve mentioned at the beginning, we will have a session at the end to ask some more questions. So if your question hasn't been answered yet, you may get another opportunity later. I'd now like to introduce Jeremy Blake, who's Managing Director of Berry Plasgran. And Jeremy, if you'd like to give your presentation. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kinza. Right, if you could just skip on to the next slide, please, and skip that one as well. So just very quickly, Berry is pretty well known by lots of people. So the principal businesses of Berry, very much like Plastipack, we're a major plastic converter, global sites, global reach, lots of places where we're making plastic products around the world. But Plasgran are a relatively small division in relation to that global whole, and Plasgran is a division of Berry that's focused very much on rigid plastic recycling. We've got a separate part to the business, BPI, which is focused on flexible recycling, but I'm here today just talking about the rigid recycling section. So I said we're fairly modest. We've got one site that's been in existence for quite a long time in the UK, in Wimbledon near Huntingdon, and we've got a second site that's under construction at the moment. So that's Berry Plasgran. If you could just skip on to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So if we're talking about, I know we've talked a lot about PET so far, and as Kinza was talking, I thought, right, okay, we may as well contrast this a little bit and look at another polymer. But if we're talking about the future, it's probably worth just having a quick snapshot look at the past. So polypropylene recycling has been around for quite a long time. So some people may well be able to find examples that go back further than this, but round about the 1980s to 2000s, there was a lot of polypropylene being used in industries, and particularly in strong areas like horticulture and sort of plastic boxes and things like that. And because of that, there was some relatively simple processing, just granulation and reintroduction of that material that was happening in some small scales. Now, around the turn of the century, there was a steady growth in interest around polypropylene recycling, still focusing on very much industrial polypropylene, so coming from manufacturing offcuts and things like that. But there started to be some interest from curbside recycling. Very, very potted use though, and the growth of the market was being pushed very much by the cost-effective nature of recycled versus virgin. So it's very much a cheap alternative to virgin, to bulk out materials. Around about 10 years ago, then things started to evolve with all the drive towards increasing recycling rates, and polypropylene slowly became one of the core polymers that was used in relation to target materials for recycling from curbside. So the target materials, if we're talking about rigid plastics, are really PET, HDPE, and polypropylene. So those three tend to be the target materials for most MRFs, with polypropylene still being the sort of poor third cousin in relation to that. Most MRFs you'll go to, or materials recycling facilities, for those who are not aware of the term, will focus on PET, mostly clear PET, and HDPE, normally with the target being things like milk bottles. But throughout this period, there's been a significant growth in the market for the recycled content to go into products, as we said, across most areas. But that growth has been difficult to fill because polypropylene has been a little bit behind the back in relation to getting the right end quality requirements to get into those places. But where those quality challenges are met, there's already examples of where recycled polypropylene has exceeded virgin as sustainability became the key market driver, even without the introduction of plastic taxes and things like that. There are spikes where RPP goes above the market. So from now into the future, we're obviously going to see lots of regulatory changes with plastic packaging tax, lots of new advanced recycling systems around the corner. So we're expecting to see significantly more higher end applications for polypropylene. Now, I would say you can mirror this very much on, let's say I'm talking about polypropylene to focus on something, but you can mirror a lot of what I'm going to say in relation to polyethylene and PET, but just sometimes the timescales are a little bit different, either technically or legislatively. Thanks, Rebecca. If you could just skip me on to the next one. So what I want to do is just really walk through the processes that are used for recycling plastics, because it's very linked to the market uses that comes to the end of it. So the first one, like I say, on this slide, you can see here on the left-hand side, you've got all the PP waste coming into it. This is the very old historic system that's been in place for a long time, where you're doing some very basic mechanical recycling, which is mostly about size reduction and extruding into large, heavy blocks of material. So I've got some rough examples here of sort of heavy industrial or just physical large volume uses like park benches and things like that. And those uses are still in existence now for some materials. Just jump onto the next one for me, Rebecca. Right. Then it evolves to be slightly more complicated, because you can do that basic mechanical recycling process of getting largely segregated materials, but through the addition of additives to improve the physical properties and colours, to make it prettier and more attractive. Then there's some more specific industrial uses. I've got the example there in the picture of pipes. Pipes may not be the best example of this, but really, realistically talking, we're still talking about fairly thick-walled applications still, but the material has been tailored very much, so it's got some visual appeals to it and some improvements in, like saying, those physical properties, so it can survive more equivalents to virgin use. If you just flick on to the next one. With the addition of material coming from the curbside, that really was the catalyst to start doing more pre-sorting before the recycling stage. So mostly through optical sorting to sort out some of the contaminants, because obviously from curbside you get a lot of materials mixed together. The other benefits you get from this is you would tend to get products grouped together in more consistent types, so you then end up getting more consistent melt flow, more consistent color palettes, and again, with the addition of some additives and colors, you can put them into more demanding industrial uses. So the applications become thinner, there might be some impact and tensile strength requirements to go into those products that can be met with those additional additives, but mostly there's still higher grade industrial uses. So if you just flick on to the next one for me. And the real issue for us in relation to polypropylene really as a situation at the moment is that those three boxes that we talked about is about 96% of the polypropylene that is recycled falls into those areas of work. And the principal market driver is really totally cost focused. So it is very much about displacing virgin to put a lower cost material. There's obviously everybody uses sustainability as and recyclability and carbon footprint, various other things as key reasons why they want to use to move into recycled content in those products. But it does come down to the price. They're nice to haves, but really the focus is about price. So where do we go on from this stage? So if you just flick onto the next slide for me. This is a case of now we're seeing this more and more in curbside recycled solutions. And this is the optical sorting process, and the mechanical recycling is much the same as it is in the above requirement, but rather than adding lots and lots of additives and colors and things like that, the focus is about doing higher level removal of things from that plastic. So we're talking about volatile organic compounds being removed from them, so things that would potentially breach a REACH compliance list, and looking at things that would producing sort of bad smells in the materials and things like that. And the work in relation to that area has been relatively successful. It's relatively widespread now, just not the technology is stable, but it's not in everywhere. But what that effectively does is open up those material streams for use in consumer packaging. But although I'm saying consumer packaging, what we're saying is not food contact or personal care use consumer packaging. We're talking about stuff that goes into, it might not be directly consumer, it might be still large bottles, but realistically it's thin-walled applications that don't have to meet any significant migration test requirements for contact use. Right, if you just jump onto the next one for me. I couldn't help but just have a quick slide here to show what the position is in relation to chemical recycling in this position, because polypropylene, if we're focusing on that, polypropylene and polyethylene are both relatively straightforward materials to put through chemical recycling routes, in inverted commas. Chemical recycling is not the best term for it. Most of the processes that can do this are some sort of pyrolysis. So it's basically heating up the materials and let the in without oxygen, so the chemical bonds break and make an oil type material. Now, those oils can be used to go back into hydrocrackers to make new virgin equivalent products. at the moment, it's an expensive process. It's a process that's going to get cheaper going forward, and it will have its place, particularly for materials which are a bit more complicated to sort mechanically. So particularly multi-layer products and things like that. I think there is going to be an increased need for them, but unfortunately, you can't help the chemistry of that process, and the chemistry of the process means that there will be light fractions that get released from that are uncondensable or not condensable in any practical terms. So they will go to fuel use. Mostly, they tend to go to drive gas generators to actually power the chemical recycling process. So it has a place, but and in the future may have a much more significant place, but certainly in the very near future, it's going to be a sort of byproduct for more complicated materials, I would say. Okay, go over the next slide, please, Rebecca. So then it leaves us with, I think, where we are right now in terms of where we can push conventional technologies to the limit to get the maximum value from polypropylene. And to get the maximum value ideally means putting that polypropylene exactly the same as Kinza was talking about earlier into circular uses. So it's putting packaging back into the packaging it came from in the first place. And it still needs the optical sorting, it still needs the washing and the mechanical recycling processes, it still needs the volatile removal, but in many cases now it's going to need an element of advanced sorting because of the legislative requirements that go through. So the legislative requirements really push you to a position where if you, for example, want to make food contact material, you have to prove that the material that went in the front end was largely food contact in the beginning. And to achieve that food contact proof, in relation to more diverse products like you get in polypropylene, several suggestions have been sort of bandied around in the past. So one of them is marker technology, which may or may not have a place going forwards, but increasingly we're seeing new AI systems, artificial intelligence systems coming on the market that will enable that level of optical sorting to be able to be done to a level which will be able to identify food grade products going in to the front end. Just pop the next slide up for me, Kinza. And I talked right at the very beginning about the new facility that we're building currently, which is due to be due for completion in August. And that facility for us is going to contain all of the equipment that I've mentioned above to be able to drive the use of that polypropylene into the highest end uses. So we're talking about artificial intelligence based solutions, as well as some very advanced batch based laboratory analysis to ensure that we stay very high quality all the time. So despite us doing that, in relation to the market for the future, my personal belief is the principal market driver for using recycled PP and in other things as well, so same for rPET and the same for our HDPE, will still be the lowest overall cost compared to virgin. The difference now is the lowest overall cost is going to factor in the plastic tax and other legislative changes. So the drivers are existing to make it, to force a position where recycled material is going to be the preferred choice for materials going forward. Now, it happens to fit into most people's agenda because of the customer perception about driving the use of plastics, driving the use of recycled plastics because of the carbon footprint element. But what that means in practical terms is that, in my view, all recycled derived products, whether it be PET, HD or polypropylene, are all going to stabilise and be in a position where they are significantly higher pound for pound than equivalent virgin materials if they meet the right quality requirements. And I believe that's my last slide. So if you just click onto the last one, and that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Jez. I'd just like to ask the first question again. You talked about the barriers that have prevented the infrastructure for PP recycling so far. Could you just explain a bit more? Is it, in terms of your Leamington Spa facility, is it the technology that has improved that's allowed you to do that, or have other factors such as, the collection and sorting technologies at MRFs improved?
Yeah, it's a magical mix of everything, actually. The technology is out now to do some of this high level sorting. Us as a business, global business, we're the same as very, very many people on this call in the fact that we've got a driver to include more recycled content for our customers. So realistically speaking, if we get to those really high-end applications for our polypropylene, we'll be putting it into products for brands and anybody who wants to make it going forward. The main constraint is still in relation to exactly the same as what Kinza was bringing up earlier, is actually the feedstock. So getting local authorities, MRFs and people to behave in the right way to get the material in the right bin into the right facilities with the right sorting capabilities is one that we need to get right to grow the volumes of material. We know that the volume of material that comes through for recycling is much lower than where we want it to be, and there is a significant opportunity there to grow that. And we just need to take every opportunity to try and push it. And one of the key things, particularly in relation to polypropylene, is demonstrating the value of it so that there is more of a driver to actually try and recover it. There needs to be an economic driver to make it happen.
And are you optimistic that that will improve, for all the reasons I asked Kinza before, EPR, GRS, etc., plastics tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're doing a lot of things right, but the big issue I've got at the moment is because we have got so many consultations and we've got so much change going on in the marketplace. On one side, we're saying we need to significantly increase our recycling rate. That would naturally lead on to us having much greater infrastructure to recycle materials and reprocess them. But with such an uncertain market, it's very difficult to actually get people to sign big checks for capital developments when the market is very volatile. So anybody who's doing it at the moment, I will take my hat off them that they've really they've really voted with one eye on the future and with real confidence in where it goes. But if you were looking at the actual detail of the numbers, it's very difficult as it's been so volatile.
Okay, we've got some questions from the audience. James George has asked a couple of questions. I'll put those both together. He's asked, where are we with food grade RPP? He understood that the FSA still hadn't approved it, and has that changed? Is any being produced and used? And he also asks, are you accepting post-consumer PP feedstock from MRFs?
Right, so I'll answer the latter one first. So yes, new facility, well, in fact, currently we do anyway. Yes, we do accept PP from MRFs, and if anybody's got any, we're very interested to have a conversation, both in terms of what you've got now, and actually really interested with conversations to say what you could potentially have in the future, because I'm very open to having conversations with people about how they could actually boost the recovery rates of the material they've got. In relation to the food grade issues, so polypropylene with EFSA is a complicated minefield of a process that currently there are no, I say no because there's no large applications for food grade approval from EFSA. That does not necessarily mean that the process is cut off from being able to apply. So I'm in a slightly tricky position at the moment, but all I will say is that our new facility will contain all of the equipment we need to be able to get us in a good position in relation to that for the future.
Linda Greener asks, she said she may have missed it, but did you say chemical recycling of PP can only be used as a fuel source?
No, it can't only be used as a fuel source. Chemical recycling of PP is, I'd like to say, relatively straightforward process. If anybody's in from the chemical recycling, I think the guys coming up after me will probably have a bit more to say about that. But polypropylene is a relatively easy thing to pyrolyze, and the challenge of it is that if you had normal packaging polypropylene and put through a pyrolysis process, it's largely pointless, because it is a very straightforward, it was even more straightforward material to mechanically recycle. There is a gap of material at the moment where there's a big block of material that you can put through mechanical recycling, and anything you can't goes to energy recovery or landfill. That's where the grey area comes in, is the gap between what can't be mechanically recycled and what goes to energy recovery and landfill. And that is the real target rich area, not just for polypropylene, but for all consumer packaging.
I'm just going to ask 3 more questions, and if you could answer them as briefly as possible, please, Jez, as just conscious of time. So Duncan Jones asks, what do you think local authorities should do to stimulate the supply of more target material?
So I think to stimulate more supply of target material, a lot of it is about communication, about saying that is the material that can be recycled. There's a lot of misinformation and belief that you still can't recycle a lot of products, particularly in relation to things like polypropylene, bathroom plastics, all these kind of things tend to people. There's a lot of perception that they can't be recycled. So consistent messaging with consistent collections, I think, is one of the changes that's coming up, and I think that is going to really help going forward. But also in relation to a lot of the infrastructure in materials recycling facilities at the moment are just not geared up for primary recycling of polypropylene. So a lot of polypropylene and jazz material and mixed coloured materials ends up going into a mixed plastic that goes to specialist facilities that then gets recycled for a plastics recycling unit. But particularly with polypropylene, the more times it's sorted and the more times it's condensed and uncondensed, because it's a relatively brittle plastic in comparison with the others, you get more breakages and it's more difficult to recover. So the earlier you can recover it in the process, the better. But it's one I'm quite happy to take offline with anybody who wants to pick up about that. I'm a complete anorak, Paul.
Question from George Wilson. What needs to be done at a research level to facilitate better understanding of how the recycling process changes materials to drive improved quality of RPP output material for these higher end consumer products?
Yeah, in relation to research and development, it's really a case of the balance, but certainly between academia and government legislation, is that the pace of change is at very different speeds. So legislative changes are incredibly slow compared to the pace of new developments that come on the market. So, we talked about chemical recycling, but it's a really good example. It's actually really difficult to put in any sort of chemical recycling facility because the legislative frameworks don't really exist to cover it. They're sort of fudged to make them fit whilst we do it. And it's the same with things like EFSA, food grade certifications. A lot of the data just hasn't been developed to say exactly what is the impact and what is the potential harm in human health. A lot of this stuff is still very isolated and still very potted. So it needs to be it would help immeasurably if there was some more standardized processes you could follow.
And just a final question to you, Jez, from Steve Owen at Walgreen Boots. Will the PCR-PP from the new Leamington Spa site be benchmarked for carbon footprint against the chemical pyrolysis PP-PCR grades so that retailers can select the PCR raw materials based on carbon/LCA?
Yes, and morning, Steve. I can tell you it's already done. So we've already done all of the LCA studies in comparison with other materials. So I've got all that data. I can happily share with him directly.
Thank you very much for your presentation and answering those questions, Jez. I'd now like to ask Timothy Juret, who's the Director of Sustainable Technology at Veolia, to give his presentation. Tim.
Hello, hi everyone. So I'm going to talk through the future of the recycling markets for plastics. I'll have to skip some slides due to time constraint, but hopefully we can cover the whole topic. So yeah, talking on behalf of Veolia, which is a waste management company. And I think the idea for me is to describe the changes we're having in the industry of plastic recycling, the new tools we are getting from the new piece of regulations, and also give some ideas or some directions on what we could direct these new tools of regulation in order to deliver what we aim for, to increase recycling rates and to lower our carbon impact as an industry. So just briefly to put things into context, we're talking about packaging plastics. That's a good third of the plastics in total, but you can see that other sectors like building and construction also consume a large amount of plastics, which I will come back to in a minute. So on the next slide, please. So if we look at the packaging plastics markets over the last few years, so that's the last 4 years here on the graph, I just wanted to highlight some correlations we historically had, which is between the value of the bottles on the market and the value of the PRN, the packaging recovery notes. So you can see, even though if it's not directly correlated, the trends are following each other's. And what is interesting to see is very recently, from May 2021, both lines crossed, so went into different directions, which means that the PRN kept dropping, but the value of the bottles kept increasing. And it's probably, in our view, it's probably a direct impact of the plastic tax, which has been announced or confirmed earlier this year, and which provide a different incentive for the off-takers like bottle manufacturers to secure the material, instead of just following the increase in recovery rate. On the next slide, please. So where we are now, we know that the recycling rate are plateauing for 3, 4, 5 years. The collection of certain plastics like the films, the pots, tubes, and trays remain low. That's what you can see on the graph on the right. And also there's a growing interest from the general public. And I think here the key thing to me is we talk about plastics, but there are different types of plastics, and they are different in a sense of obviously different polymers, but different costs, different technical solutions to recycle them. And while we bring new tools or in the regulation, I think we should keep this in mind that, for example, the plastic tax won't affect the same way that the plastic bottles, then it will affect the film collection and recycling. I think on the previous presentation, we touched base on that. When it comes to the 30% recycling contents, the plastic bottles are already there for the vast majority, but that's not the case for pots, tubes, and trays and films. So the drivers, incentives will be different. On the next slide, please. So we got the new tools coming. We got the deposit return scheme. We got the consistency of collection. We got the extended producer's responsibility, and we could even add the plastic tax on top of that. But these new tools will be in addition to the ones we already have. And what we need to ensure as an industry, and they are articulated the right way in order to achieve our objective. One quite complex one, but key one, is the extended producer's responsibility with the modulated fee, which will in a way tax the badly designed or the not eco-friendly design packaging, but will incentive the good designs when it comes to usage of monopolymers, avoid multi-layers, etc. But also it will provide certain level of funding, which is not yet fully described in the consultation, how the money captured by or collected from the EPR modulated fees, how this money will be used, and how it will promote not only the collection of the plastic waste, the plastic packaging waste, but also the recycling, because it's good to collect more, like with the deposit return scheme and the consistency of collection. But if we don't get the right infrastructure to recycle at the back end, that might create some bottlenecks in the chains. On the next slide, please. Just a few slides on an existing tool we have, the collection methodology. So as each local authorities can decide the way they want to collect. If they do a curbside sort, so the multi-stream, or dual stream, twin stream with two bins, one for fiber or glass and all the other recycling into another bin, or the fully commingle. I think that's an important tool we need to use. And on the next slide, please. We've done some exercise with St. Albans Council, where we shifted the way we collected with a different size of bins, a different frequency. And what we've noticed is within 6 months, we had an increase of 10% of recycling rates, which was obviously very good news, but it shows the importance of the connection between the general public and the infrastructure, the solution we are putting in place along with the local authorities. Which can have also a very high impact. So we're looking to keep going that way. On the next slide, please. The last tool, as I mentioned, is the plastic tax. So we're already seeing the effect on the market. But what I think the key thing on the plastic tax is the first version is £200 per ton tax on the if the packaging has got less than 30%. Which is a great start. I think it was important for the government to launch something to send a message to the industry. But I think what we are, our position is there should be at some point a review or an escalation of the tax, because 30% is good enough, is high enough as a percentage to incentivize the film recycling. For example, you might see in the news all the announcements with soft recycling investments. But for the bottle recycling, 30% is probably not enough. So I think we'll see in the next few months, in the next few years, a review on different stream of plastics and not as plastics as a whole, because there are differences between the different streams. On the next slide, please. So this is a roadmap put together by the UK Waste Plastic Flows, and which shows that where we will need the investment, the new infrastructure to achieve the targets by 2030. And you can see that the more we want to divert plastics away from landfill, away from energy recovery, then it's likely that we will need 3 times, 4 times, 5 times sometimes the mechanical recycling infrastructure we have, but also the development of the non-mechanical recycling, such as enhanced/chemical recycling. So all of these will be needed. We will need them all. They got different properties, they got different capital intensity, but what is sure is there's the amount of infrastructure we are talking. If also in the same time we want to reduce the export, what we export out of the UK is a huge scale, and that's why we think that the support, the incentive for the infrastructure is paramount in order to achieve. Otherwise, we will collect more plastics, but we won't be able to find a home, domestic home to recycle all this new tonnage. On the next slide, please. I'll be very quick on that one. You can ignore the process flow diagram, but the key thing is to show that along with the plastic packaging recycling, there's other material which will be introduced into our sorting facilities in the UK, so the MRF, and most of them will need retrofit, will need replacements in the next years to come. So that's another additional investment we will need as a country if we want to cope with all the additional collection streams and the increase of complexity, of diversity of the material. So we can talk about aluminium foils, trays, cartons, along with the plastic streams we mentioned earlier. So all of that means that we need more recycling. We will need to adapt our sorting facilities, and you can imagine the price tag attached to each of these retrofit. It becomes quite it will need some time, and it will need some serious investments as a country scale. On the next slide, please. So we will need more infrastructure for sure. and this will require some commitment, some visibility, both from the regulator, but also from the off-takers. So whoever's going to, the product manufacturers, the packaging manufacturers, everyone will gain in visibility and long-term commitments, because that's what it takes to build new facilities. There's clearly at the moment there's still volatility, so we need the EPR mechanism is something which is not fully defined yet. There's some discussion about a green revolution fund to use part of the EPR money to not only promote the collection, but also the recycling. So how can this help to support the value chain on the hard to recycle plastics? And the last one is also to bear in mind that the migration from plastic packaging to other, let's say, less desirable packaging, at least on the carbon intensity point of view. We do have recycling rate objectives as a country, but we also have a net zero strategy in place. And plastic does help towards that. And recycling it does help even more. So when we recycle plastics, it's 30 to 80% carbon reduction compared to virgin plastics. But we also know that plastic packaging, by definition, is less carbon intensive than alternative packaging for our products. On the last slide, please. So just as a summary, we do have the technical know-how. Even the hard to recycle plastics, after a few trials, when we put the right stakeholders together, we've got the solution technically. Recycling more means also creation of jobs, which is, I think, is we think is really important in the current climate with the crisis we're having at the moment. But also it preserves our resources, and the carbon aspect is is a dominant term that we didn't have probably 3-5 years ago, but now it's around. There are potentially the carbon tax will be at a higher price, etc., etc. So I think all of that together, when we combine, there's definitely a need and a logic behind increasing our recycling rate domestically and rely less on exportations of this waste. But for that, it's clear, because of the scale of the challenge we have, the scale of the tonnage and capacity we'll need around the country, it needs to be clear signs via the plastic tax, but also from the EPR modulated fee to really support truly the value chains. Otherwise, there's a risk we're going to lag behind. For sure, there are some good initiatives going around. There are some good announcements, etc., etc. But again, the scale we've got of the challenge we've got in front of us is very very important. So we need to address that with the right tools and potentially review these tools in the near future to make sure we meet our targets. So thank you very much. That's it for me. Sorry, it was very quick because I need to leave for another call. I might have time for 1 or 2 questions, but yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Hopefully it was useful and informative for you.
Tim, thank you very much for that. We have got 2 questions. Are you okay just to quickly answer those?
Yeah, take 1 or 2, that's okay. And after I'll have to leave the call. But let's do it.
No problem. Simon from the Body Shop asks, what can be done quickly to increase the scope of PET that's recycled at scale? Currently focuses on clear PET bottles, so good quality PET that's coloured or in non-bottle formats such as trays and jars are not recycled. Consumers are frustrated. So
on the PET, I think it was discussed, explained in a previous presentation. The bottleneck is a collection. In terms of recycling more PET, it's what we need to tackle is the collection rate, the capture rate. And it's where the deposit return scheme will provide most of the answer, not all of the answer, but it's where we need to act really is on the collection side, because the end market is there, the prices are going up, the demand is going up. So I'm talking of the clear PET bottles here. So sorry, the PET bottles. On the PET trays, that's a different challenge. I mean, we've got a project ongoing with Innovate UK to develop a bespoke solutions for PET trays. And hopefully, we're making trials at the moment, and if positive, we'll invest into a new facility.
Can you take one more?
Sure.
Yeah. Linda O asks, where are the technical or innovation gaps in recycling these new materials in safe, low carbon way, domestically and internationally?
I'd say the the challenge we face on the what I would call the hard to recycle, because that's how we call them, is a value chain. We are not a high margin industry, but the capital investment is quite high. So what we need to ensure is the value chain is stable enough to allow investors like Veolia, but all the other waste management companies to invest into new facilities, because technically it does work. Technically, as I mentioned in the presentation, when we put the equipment suppliers, the experts, etc. There's always a solution to recycle. But when we need is a right value chain in order to trigger the investment really, and also I would say there's a bit of economy of scale. So when we've got a very specific items, you can understand that it's more difficult to recycle, to invest for small volumes than it is for large volume of material, because again, value of chain and economy of scale.
Tim, thank you very much for your time. I'm conscious you need to go.
Thank you very much.
We'll now move on to Jeff Brighty, who's non-executive director of Renew ELP. Jeff.
Thanks very much, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Thanks to my previous three speakers, because it's raised quite a few points that I think are relevant to the role of chemical or non-mechanical recycling within the whole plastic value chain. And what I hope to get across really is how we can work together, because I think as hopefully it's come across already, is that no one technology will deliver all the outcomes that we're looking for in this new world. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, in terms of the setup here, so Mura Technology are the technology owners of Hydro PRS. It was a technology that was developed originally in Australia to extract oil from lignite coal, but Mura has the license to develop the technology to take basically unrecyclable plastic back into hydrocarbon. And the first plant that is being built to take that to scale to our first 20,000 tonne plant is the Renew ELP plant up in Teesside. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, but we have our partners. Our offtake partner is Dow. Our build out to the technology partner is KBR. We work alongside investor IGUS, who are a plastic specialist manufacturer. Geminor are our aggregator, basically securing the plastic supply. And we're pleased to be working with EcoSurety for the compliance-based scheme aspects of what we do. So that's the family of the companies and organisations involved. Next slide, please. So you've heard a little bit about chemical recycling and kind of what it is and maybe perhaps what it isn't. So I'm just going to try and give a high-level overview of really about this new sector. I've termed it here for a new era. I mean, the world is changing. Some of the world around COP, even though Adam Reed from CRWM rightly pointed out that waste really didn't feature as one of the themes in COP. It is hugely important that we get to grips with waste as a means of delivering sustainability for our planet and getting that resource efficiency to the level we want it to be. But it's a new technology at scale, although a lot of the technologies in this family, and we've got thermal technologies like pyrolysis, or in our case, a hydropyrolysis process, but also depolymerization, solvolysis. There's a whole range of different technologies, some using microwave, for example, and a real family of companies developing in the UK, which is really exciting to create this new sector. And it sits between the established waste and recycling sectors and the chemical sectors. So the diagram to the right just helps to identify exactly where we sit. That blob, the waste lozenge there, is really important because it's important that we're taking the material from the waste collected, the plastic waste collected, all the way through into, back down to the consumer. We need to understand what the consumer's needs, and we've talked a little bit this morning already about behaviours. We want to demonstrate that there's a sector there that can take the unrecyclable plastic waste that people assume is ending up on the shores of the seas around the globe, or in landfill sites, or in energy from waste plants, or indeed just dumped and burnt, as we've seen from the legal waste exports. The technologies are, as this family, it's not just about the process, it's also about the scale. And some of these technologies lend themselves to be working alongside a MRF. Others are definitely suited better for chem parks, which is where we're based. And the output that we produce effectively goes back into chemical manufacturing. We're focusing largely on the plastic sector, but not exclusively. And as you'll notice for the definition, and there is no real definition in law certainly not in the UK, although this is a conversation we're having with DEFRA right now, is about this transformational process. But it's important that we exclude energy recovery. We're not interested in the process to take all this effort to then create a fuel. We want this material to remain in circularity, and that's the key thing here. That obviously impacts on things like PRN payments. So this is this new sector. The sector really has come to the fore partly because of this issue around exports, the brand demand, both for ability to recycle packaging, but then also to supply recycle it back. The issue of resource depletion. We don't want to be using fossil fuel or fossil oil once and then throwing it all away. But then, of course, the issue of sustainability and the issue around net zero and government measures that are trying to improve that sustainability. So there's a whole range of new drivers in this new era that I think the timeline that Jez put out there demonstrates we really have come a long way in 20 years. Next slide, please. And here's a very simple example that aligns really to the current measures that are coming out from government. Although Kinza talked about PET packaging, we look at other food packaging that's non-PET. There's a very limited alternative supply of the food grade plastic from a recycled source. You can just think about HDPE and milk bottles, perhaps as a closed loop being perhaps what's the strongest example here. And that means that the packaging, the value, the cost of packaging on the market, therefore, is going to be hit hard because it's going to be the companies are going to be hit by the 30% plastics tax in the full force. And then so they can't get hold of the recycled, the material then goes back on the market. That material is then not recyclable, and that will tend to put them into the higher EPR charge bands under modulated fees. So for food manufacturers looking at PP, and LD and HDPE, there's some real challenges with how they can secure supplies of recyclable and have their material recycled within the current system. And so what we're trying to do here is to avoid, as Jez mentioned, about this diversion of plastic to energy from waste. We want to take that plastic out of energy from waste and put it back into a recycling process where we can reclaim those hydrocarbons out and then supply those back into the plastics manufacturing process and avoid the resource loss and also the carbon emissions that are present with energy from waste. So let's move on to LCA, which I think is really important. The next slide, please. So you have to ask some serious questions here. Is it better to burn or to sort that 1 ton of waste plastic? And we know that by burning waste plastic, you create over 3 tons of CO2 if you're burning it in energy from waste. Going through a chemical recycling process like ours, you can reduce that by some measure. This has been fairly well touted in various LCAs over the last 2 or 3 years. And that's even if you take out the energy that ton of plastic would have otherwise generated and the sorting costs, even in our process. We're saving over 2.5 tons of CO2. And burning plastic is really bad for the planet. If we think coal is our target here, we're looking at a 38% greater global warming potential by burning plastic than by burning coal. So this is not a good place to be. LCAs are coming out all the time now on the chemical recycling processes. We'll have ours out early in the new year. And the indications are that we are able to generate hydrocarbon feedstock at an equivalent or better global warming potential than the current fossil system. So in other words, we're able to do this better than the high scale refineries that are taking oil out of the ground and producing a fossil-based naphtha for the chemical processing process. And of course, if we're not taking oil out of the ground, we are able to then do more on resource depletion, and we're representing, we think, around over 90% saving on fossil oil by comparison to the extraction of oil, simply by just recycling that material in our process. So the challenge here is, how do we design a system? If you look at what Mike Shaver has done from his group in Manchester on this one bin project, it's all about keeping carbon in circularity, but working alongside those processes that we want to work with, not least mechanical recycling. But we want to decarbonize the waste, chemicals and plastic sectors in one go. And if we're able to do that through our process, it will actually also allow us to take advantage of renewable energy. So not only can we do that on merits from the current system, we're also able to attract renewable energy into our process, which will reduce the carbon footprint even further. Importantly for this webinar, I think it's important to demonstrate that we are a viable end market for the unrecyclable or non-recycled plastics currently on the market. And I'll touch on which forms we're targeting in a moment. But importantly for brands, it means that their packaging can be recycled and we can supply them with recycled content. And yes, the tax is a tax and it goes into general taxation, but it is meant to be driving system change. And we do believe that this is the right thing to do, is we have recycled content going into food grade packaging, and chemical recycling in the round can do that. Next slide, please. So in terms of where are we in terms of the problem, we need to achieve 70% effective recycling by 2025. This is the UK Plastics Pact target, and we're looking at a shortfall in processing of 440,000 tonnes within the UK, spread across what's believed to be the projected tonnage to be recycled by 2025. This is still very much work in progress by the UKPP. But of course, if exports drop for a variety of reasons, not least through the Basel Convention measures, then that number of 441 is going to only increase. So the challenge is then, how do we do this? We need to demonstrate that we are able to get to scale. And I think Tim's last slide on the chemical recycling capacity, I think, will be outstripped by the mid-2020s. We'll be at 300,000 tonnes this UK or more by the mid-2020s, even based on recent announcements. So we need to demonstrate that we are a complementary system working alongside mechanical, that we have that end market. Technology scaling is now happening, but those technologies also need to embrace that net zero ambition. It's not what we do, it's also how we do it. And we are definitely now looking at the policy and regulatory alignment. So we're in conversations with DEFRA, for example, through the UK Plastic Pact Non-Mechanical Recycling Group, to ensure that there's a level playing field for all recycling technologies, and then with the aim, therefore, that all can work together on a fair and a transparent basis. And one of the measures I'll highlight there is the enhanced and consistent collection. If we don't collect the plastic, we can't process it. I think that goes across the board of all technologies. Next slide, please. So given the need, challenges and opportunities and the problem, how does our process deliver the recycling that we're looking for here? So we're a thermal process, but we're water-based. So we're not like traditional pyrolysis, which you would heat plastic. In the absence of oxygen, we're using a water-based process, which gives us the advantage that the material doesn't have to be dry going into the process. We are basically cleaning, pre-sorting the plastic that comes in hopefully in a good form, but we obviously want to make sure we're protecting our process. It goes into our extruder under pressure. It's mixed with steam, heated, and passed through our hydro-PRS solid-state reactor. That's where the chemical reactions are happening. That's where we're ending up being able to break down the polymers into short-chain hydrocarbons and through a depressurization step. So our process being at high pressure allows us to then do flash distillation. So we don't end up with a mixed oil, we end up with a series of fractions, which basically derive into separate products. And one of those products are then passed over to the processors for onward processing into the plastic feedstock that will go back into food production. Our target plastics, primarily it's polyethylene, both high density and low density, and polypropylene, so polyolefin families. We can tolerate some other plastics. We don't want PVC because of the chloride. It's not great to have hydrochloric acid in one's process. But also it's not just about packaging. Other plastics are available to us, so agricultural, but we are primarily looking at MRF and anaerobic digestion residual material, but also the material that's diverted from energy from waste. In other words, material that's otherwise going to be burnt or sent to landfill. That's the opportunity we see as the primary need to improve circularity. Next slide, please. Just a quick schematic of our plant. They're not massive. You might think of chem parks and large refineries. We're not at that sort of scale, but we are suited to these sorts of locations because of the symbiosis with the onward processors and also for transport. And obviously a lot of these sites are rated as coma sites. So we sit within that sort of family of processes, but we're not huge. And actually the largest element of our plant is actually the plastic cleaning. And if we could optimize the mechanical recycling processes ahead of what we receive, then that plant will be a lot smaller. Next slide, please. So in terms of products, what we're looking at here are products that will essentially go back as steam cracker feedstock, so a naphtha cracker feedstock and distillate gas oil, potentially also heavy gas oil could also go into some steam crackers. We're working with different off-takers in that conversation. The heavy wax residue, this is interesting because this is one thing we haven't talked about is in terms of the quality of what comes out of mechanical and chemical recycling. What that fraction is able to deal with is the colorants. So what we're producing essentially is a hydrocarbon feedstock that goes back into chemical refining. But actually what we're taking out here are the solids and also the colours, so that material goes back without that as a problem to solve, as it would be percent mechanical recycling. We do produce a small amount of processed gas, but that's coming not from the hydrocarbon, that's coming from contaminants like food residue and also things like paper. So our products are the products that come from the polymer. Bear in mind, you've got things like fillers, which will also end up in the heavy wax residue, and that can go into as a bitumen binder. Next slide, please. So my last slide, really just to try and summarize really the role that's going to be played by chemical recycling that's now coming to scale. We can recycle the flexible multi-layered materials that have been mentioned already that are not readily processed by mechanical means. We can deal with colors. So we're talking about designing for recycling here. Polymers or materials is really helpful, but it's not a barrier to us. And we can take multi-layered and multi-polymer material into our process. So that may mean that people do not need to redesign their packaging. We are talking about post-consumer contaminated materials, so it's not ideal for mechanical. And obviously, the more processing is done either by mechanical or chemical recycling, that increases carbon footprint. So we are able to take contaminated materials that are otherwise not necessarily ideal for mechanical. We want to complement mechanical recycling processes. And if you look at, again, at the one bin paper, it talks about how as an ecosystem, they should work together. We're not in competition, we should be complementing each other. We would like to think this is reducing the need for exports, but instead we're exporting hydrocarbon rather than plastic waste. And obviously, we'd like to think it's also helping to reduce costly packaging redesigns and create the belief in the system this material in packaging is able to be recycled. But as I said, it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. We can see a very clear pathway to net zero, both in how we process on the current grid, but obviously how we can achieve that through going to renewable power supply. We also are able to reduce resource depletion, which will become an increasing conversation over the next 20 years, and produce renewable chemicals to go into the chemical sector and helping them also decarbonise on their pathway to net zero. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. We have got a couple of questions. I'm also conscious of time, so if you could try and keep the answers brief, please. Nick Hunt from Jones Healthcare Group asks, what is the practical limit for PVC? Could the process be optimised to handle the current percent in the mixed waste stream?
We're trying to avoid it because I mentioned the issues of chloride. It's not great for a wet process in terms of hydrochloric acid. That said, it is a research question, and we're chewing on that now with the academic partners that we have. So it's a kind of watch this space. We might be able to do something that might be able to address that by perhaps some sort of pre-process, but nothing possible at this scale at this stage.
And we have a question from Steve Owen at Walgreen Boots. How pure does the feedstock need to be? And is it possible to accept the hard to recycle consumer products that retailers are now collecting in the in-store take-back bins, such as mascaras, lipsticks, toothpaste tubes, I guess stuff with a lot of residue?
We've said, this is the presentation, that we're able to deal with some of the contaminants, so not least food. We'll be happy to explore particular types of feedstocks. We have discussed different cosmetics in the past because we recognise this material might be slightly long-lived in the supply chain, but then when it arrives, that material does have a value within the process. As long as it's polymeric, we can take that out. We would try and remove any metals, for example, in the packaging well beforehand. So the polymeric material should be recyclable. And we've been looking at also not just thermoplastic, but thermoset materials as a potential feedstock for the process. So it is definitely a conversation that we would like to have if members of the audience would like to engage with me after the call.
And it will need to be after the call. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your presentation and for answering those couple of questions. Just before I hand over to Steve, I'd just like to thank, on behalf of everybody really, Amanda, Rebecca and Steve from Recoup for organising this really fascinating and interesting webinar. As Steve mentioned earlier, there are some more in the next few days and weeks, so please do join those. And Steve, I'd like to hand over to you for your final comments.
Thanks very much, Paul. Just again to say thank you very much for all the questions that came through today. There was a lot of interest there. We will be collating the questions that we couldn't answer during this session and putting that round in a document, and also recirculating the slides and the recording of the session as well. As I say, if you've got any more interest or in the other webinars, please go to the last member update, which sent out last Friday, or to our website, and you can sign up for the other webinars as well. There's some really good points that I took from today's webinar. We need to collect more material. Kinter's has some excellent points around the PET packaging market's going to grow. We obviously need to actually get more material back into those products again. And there's some fascinating technology developing through Veolia, through Renew, and also with Berry Plasgran as well. So it's great to actually see some of the more of the detail and how that's going to develop over time. So thanks everyone again. If you've got any further questions, please do contact the Recoup team. And apart from that, have a great day and goodbye. Thank you.